The wind carried the smell of dust and smoke across the canyon, twisting it into the fading light of evening. The sun sank low behind the rugged cliffs, painting the sky in colors of fire and blood. Silence ruled the land except for the call of a hawk, circling far above, watching as if it already knew the fate that was about to unfold. In that silence stood a young woman, her heart beating faster than the river below, caught between fear and something she could not yet name. She had grown up in a world that told her what was right and what was wrong. Yet nothing in her life had prepared her for the eyes now fixed on her, dark, steady, and filled with secrets older than the land itself. He was Apache. His presence both wild and commanding, carved from years of survival in a country that gave little and demanded much. His skin was marked by the sun, his shoulders broad from battle and labor, his silence more powerful than 100 words. She had heard stories of his people tales, whispered by campfires, spoken in the fearful tones of settlers who could not understand the ways of those who lived free. Yet here he was, not a shadow of fear, but a man of flesh and spirit, standing before her as if time itself had guided them to this very place. The land seemed to hold its breath as their eyes locked, and the world beyond the canyon faded into nothing. Her dress, once neat and proper, now bore the marks of struggle. A single tear in the fabric told a story of a chase through unforgiving terrain, of hands that had grasped not to harm but to hold her still, to stop her from fleeing into the wilderness. She felt his strength in that moment, not cruel, not careless, but unyielding, as if nature itself had taken human form and wrapped around her. She could have screamed, could have fought harder, but something within her silenced the fear. She whispered words she barely understood herself, words that carried more weight than she could bear. Finish it. They slipped past her lips, like a secret she did not mean to share. And yet once spoken, they could not be taken back. His gaze did not waver. He did not move to strike, nor to harm. Instead, he leaned closer, his forehead brushing hers, and she felt the heat of his breath mingling with her own. For a fleeting instant, it was not two strangers facing each other, but two souls pressed together by the pull of fate, bound by something deeper than choice. She did not know why her chest ached in that moment, why her heart longed for both escape and closeness. All she knew was that the world she thought she understood was crumbling, like dry earth beneath her feet. She remembered her father's warnings, the endless stories of raids, of families torn apart, of the Apache who were said to vanish into the night like spirits. But looking at him now, she realized those tales were not the whole truth. There was something else, something human, something raw and unshaken by the weight of lies that had been built between their worlds. His silence carried more honesty than the words she had been fed since childhood. And deep within her, a spark of suspicion began to grow, that the greatest danger was not the man before her, but the secrets that had been hidden from her all along. The canyon walls echoed with memories, whispers of ancestors, and the unbroken spirit of the land itself. He finally spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying both power and pain. His words were not in her tongue, yet she felt their meaning deep inside, as though her blood recognized something her mind could not. She shivered, not from fear, but from the weight of realization that this meeting was not chance. It was part of a story long set in motion, one written in the scars of the earth and carried in the wind. Night crept in slowly, wrapping the canyon in shadows. A fire crackled nearby, throwing sparks into the air that danced like restless spirits. She sat close, her dress torn, but her resolve stronger than it had ever been. He sat across from her, his eyes never leaving hers, and though the silence stretched, it was not empty. It was heavy with the unspoken, with questions she was too afraid to ask and answers he seemed unwilling to share. The firelight flickered across his face, carving sharp lines of strength and sorrow, as if he bore the weight of generations upon his shoulders. She thought of her home, of the walls that had once made her feel safe, of the family who believed they understood the world. Yet here, under the endless stretch of stars, she felt closer to truth than she ever had within those walls. The stories she had been told no longer fit the shape of reality. Something inside her was breaking, and in its place grew something dangerous: curiosity. a hunger for knowledge, for understanding. But with it came fear, for truth was not always kind. Truth had teeth. Truth could tear apart the life she thought she knew. As the fire burned lower, she leaned forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Why me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He did not answer immediately, only watched her with that same unshaken gaze, as though the answer was too large, too heavy for the night to carry. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, each one chosen like a stone laid upon a path that stretched into the unknown. "Because you are not who they told you to be." The earth seemed to shift beneath her. Her breath caught. Her hands tightened in her lap, and the flames crackled louder as if mocking the silence that followed. She wanted to demand more, to shake the truth from him. But something in his eyes warned her that the truth was not a gift freely given. It was something earned, something faced, something survived. Her heart thundered in her chest as the weight of his words sank into her. Not who they told you to be. What did that mean? Who was she, if not the girl she had always believed? The stars above stretched endless and cold, but the heat between them was undeniable. The night pressed close, the canyon walls holding in the secrets that neither of them yet dared to speak. She looked at him, her mind racing with questions, her soul torn between fear and yearning. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its cry long and lonely, echoing through the night like a warning. And she realized that whatever path lay ahead, it would not lead her back to the life she had known. It would drag her deeper into mystery, into danger, into a truth that could shatter everything. She met his gaze again, her breath steadying despite the storm inside her. She wanted to believe he would protect her, but she also feared that he might be the very one to destroy her world. Still, something within whispered that she had no choice but to follow where this story was leading. For the dress may have been torn, her whisper may have been reckless. Odd. But it was the hidden truth that waited in the shadows, which would decide her fate. And as the fire burned down to glowing embers, she understood that her life had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. Would the truth set her free? Or would it bind her to a destiny she had never asked for? The answer lay ahead, waiting in silence. Just beyond the reach of firelight, the embers pulsed like the heartbeat of the canyon, glowing red against the dark. She pulled her knees close, her eyes fixed on the fire, though her mind was far from its warmth. His words still lingered, circling in her thoughts, pulling at the fabric of her identity. Not who they told you to be. It was a simple phrase, yet it pressed down on her chest with the weight of mountains. Every memory she thought she understood, every story her family had told her, now felt fragile, as if one gust of wind could scatter them into dust. Across the fire, the Apache watched her quietly. His stillness unsettled her. He seemed carved out of the night itself, like the land had shaped him to be both guardian and threat. His silence was not emptiness, but patience, as though he had seen too many nights like this before. She wondered if he knew the way her stomach twisted, the way her hands shook when she thought of what awaited her beyond this canyon. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but each time she opened her mouth, the words died. Instead, she let the fire crackle between them, each spark rising like a fleeting thought that never reached the stars. Her mind traveled backward, back to her earliest memories of home. She could still see the wooden porch where her mother sat at dawn, the thin light of morning stretching across fields that never seemed to end. She remembered her father's steady voice, warning her never to wander too far, never to trust the shadows beyond the horizon. He spoke of raids, of dangers that lurked beyond the fences, of people who lived outside the reach of law. She had believed him, trusted his every word, for his voice was steady and filled with certainty. Yet here she was, sitting in the wild heart of that very fear, and nothing felt the way she had been told it would. The Apache did not strike her as savage or cruel. His presence carried weight, yes, but it was not the kind of danger her father's words had painted. If anything, the danger seemed to come from the truth he held back, the truth he hinted at with a single sentence. She thought of her mother's eyes. Oh, always careful, always avoiding questions that mattered. There were moments when she had asked about her family's past, about where they came from before settling by the river. Her mother would smile tightly and change the subject. At the time she had thought little of it. Now those silences echoed louder than any words. Perhaps the truth had been buried long before this night, hidden beneath layers of fear and convenience, waiting for someone else to reveal it. The Apache stirred, reaching into a leather pouch at his side. He drew out a small piece of cloth, old and frayed, the edges worn by time. He placed it near the firelight so she could see. The pattern was unlike anything she had ever known in her home. Geometric shapes woven in earthy tones. The kind of design she had only glimpsed on rare trips into trading posts. Her breath caught as her fingers reached out, brushing against the rough texture. Something stirred deep inside her, a sense of recognition she could not explain. He spoke softly. It's the words in his language, but she caught the tone, the gravity. His hand rested on the cloth with care, almost reverence. She looked from the fabric to his face, searching for meaning. "What is it?" she whispered. He studied her for a long moment before answering in halting English. "It belongs to you." Her chest tightened. She shook her head, the denial rising instinctively. "No, I've never seen it before." But even as she spoke, a part of her rebelled against the lie. The design spoke to her, not through memory, but through something older, something buried in her very blood. She pulled her hand back as though burned, her thoughts racing faster than she could control. The canyon around them seemed to lean closer, listening, pressing its shadows against her shoulders. She wanted to flee into the night, to escape the fire, the man, the truth. Yet her feet refused to move. It was as if the land itself held her in place, forcing her to confront what had been hidden. She wondered if her father had known, if her mother's silences had been more than simple fear. Perhaps the life she had grown up with was built on secrets, carefully woven to keep her blind. The Apache folded the cloth again, sliding it back into the pouch with deliberate care. He did not press her further, though his eyes told her he had more to say when the time came. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the darkness beyond the fire, his body alert, listening to sounds she could not hear. She followed his eyes but saw nothing but black shadows clinging to the rocks. Still, unease grew in her chest. Out here, the night belonged to more than just them. A sudden rustle echoed across the canyon, carried by the wind. She froze, her pulse quickening. The Apache's hand moved to the knife at his belt with a smoothness that came from years of practice. His body tensed, but he did not rise. He listened, waited, then relaxed only slightly. "Coyote," he said, his voice low. But she saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes stayed sharp. He was not entirely convinced, and neither was she. The fire sputtered as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust. She shivered, drawing her torn dress closer around her shoulders. The warmth of the flames no longer felt enough. She thought again of the life she had left behind, the safe walls, the familiar voices. It felt so far away now, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. She wondered if she would ever see it again, and if she did, whether she would recognize it the same way. He finally broke the silence, his voice steady, but edged with something she could not name. "Your people do not tell the whole story. They fear what they do not understand." His eyes met hers again, and in them she saw no malice, only the heavy burden of truth. She wanted to ask what story he meant, what truth lay behind his words, but fear kept her quiet. Deep inside, she knew that once she heard it, there would be no going back. The night stretched long, filled with the weight of questions unspoken. She found herself staring at the stars, wondering if they held answers the earth refused to give. Each one seemed eternal, yet cold, distant from the struggles below. Still, they reminded her of something larger than herself, a reminder that her life was a thread in a much greater fabric. And perhaps that fabric had been woven long before she was born. Sleep came to her in fragments, restless and shallow. Dreams twisted into visions of shadowed figures moving through firelight, voices calling her name in a language she did not understand. She woke with her heart racing, her breath uneven, only to find the Apache still awake, watching the horizon as though waiting for dawn to reveal something. His vigilance unsettled her. But it also gave her a strange sense of safety, as the first pale light of morning broke across the canyon. Painting the cliffs in gold, she realized her world had already shifted. She was no longer just the daughter of settlers, no longer just a girl taught to fear what lay beyond her fence. She was part of something larger, tangled in a web of history and secrets she had barely begun to touch. And though she wanted to run from it, she knew the path ahead would not let her. The Apache's words, his silence, his gaze, everything pointed to a truth waiting in the shadows. A truth that would not be denied. But as the sun climbed higher, warming the stone around them, she could not escape the fear that once uncovered. The hidden truth would not just change her life, it would destroy the foundation of everything she had ever known. By noon, the canyon had shaken off the chill of night, and heat lifted from the stones in wavering lines. The Apache stood and studied the sky as if he could read it like a map. She rose more slowly, muscles sore from sleep on hard ground, mind sore from questions with no place to rest. He motioned for her to follow and started toward a narrow cleft in the rock. The path was barely wider than a boot, winding between thorn and juniper. Ravens watched from a ledge. Their cries sounded like warnings and kept her nerves sharp. They moved in silence at first. Then he spoke, choosing English with care. There were riders on the flats, he said, men who did not belong to his band and did not belong to her family either. Drifters mixed with hired hands paid to find trouble. He described the smell of their camp, the iron taste of their cooking pots, the way their horses wore city shoes that cracked on stone. She pictured men from the railroad camps or from a border town where quick money turned to quicker violence. The idea made her throat tighten. If they were searching these canyons, then this meeting was not the only story running under the sun. They reached a shelf of rock that opened to a hidden basin. A slim thread of water fell from a dark seam and spread into a pool so clear it reflected every blade of grass. Here the land softened. Cottonwoods leaned toward the water, and the stain of old fires marked a circle of stones. He knelt and touched the ash. Not long, he said. A different band had rested here, then moved on. He pointed to a print near the edge of the pool. It was small, a child's step pressed into damp sand. A pulse went through her chest that felt like grief, though she could not have said why. He gave her time to drink and wash the dust from her face. When she lifted her eyes, he was watching the far rim. She followed his gaze and glimpsed the faint shape of smoke trailing into the bright air. Another camp. Another story reaching toward theirs. She remembered the cloth he had shown her and wanted to ask for it again. To study the pattern in daylight, yet fear made her resist. If she accepted it, if she felt that thread pull tighter, then the life she had known would shift again under her feet. They left the basin by a deer trail and climbed to a lookout that watched the long sweep of land toward the river. From here she could see the ribbon of cottonwoods that marked the water, and beyond that, the pale scars of a new wagon road cut by men with stakes and survey chains. She could almost hear the promise those men spoke in towns where people crowded into church halls to dream of progress. Mills turning, telegraph clicking, trains carving the country in iron. Her father had stood in those halls, his hat in his hands, nodding along as speakers promised safety and trade. He had been a quiet believer. Now, she wondered if he had been guarding something else entirely. The Apache told her they would circle south. He knew a trading post where an old woman kept stories as carefully as she kept her shelves. She had stitched cloth for many families, he said, and often knew where a pattern first began. His eyes held hers as he added that the journey would be watched. His band would not show themselves, but they would see her. They would weigh what kind of heart she carried. They moved from shade to shade through early afternoon. Lizards darted from their steps. A vulture drifted overhead, a dark pinwheel against the bright sky. As they walked, she felt the land learning her weight. Pebbles shifted a certain way under her boots, and thorns snagged her torn dress in the same places. Her senses sharpened until she could tell the difference between wind in grass and wind on stone. When the Apache stopped, she could almost guess why before he spoke horse sign, fresh on the trail heading east. He crouched low, teaching her how to read the ground. She saw the story of a tired gelding, a rider heavy in the saddle, a second horse led behind. The second horse dragged its right hind a little, leaving a smudged crescent. She found herself whispering the signs back to him. and his nod carried a small spark of approval that steadied her. Before sunset, they found the trading post tucked between low hills, its walls built of logs and the bones of old wagons. A weathered sign swung on a chain. Pepper hung in strings by the door. Inside, air cooled by clay jars held the scents of coffee, leather, and sage. The old woman behind the counter had hair the color of snow and eyes like flint. She looked from the Apache to the girl, then to the torn dress, and her gaze softened. She spoke a language the girl did not know, and then switched to English, her voice crisp as a winter morning. "Travelers come in pairs when the land means to change them," she said. "What did they bring to trade?" The Apache placed the folded cloth on the counter. The old woman reached for it with both hands and held it as some hold a prayer. Her thumb traced the lines of the pattern. She pointed to small details the girl had not noticed, 2 stitches tending toward the wrong angle, a thread darkened by smoke, a color once bright but faded by many washings. Then the old woman asked the girl to hold out her wrist. The girl obeyed, though confusion flickered through her. The woman studied the small marks that most would overlook, skin lighter where a bracelet could have rested long ago. A faint line near the thumb, as if from a child's cut, healed clean. The woman gave a small nod that meant more than words. "This cloth came from the river bend where willow and cottonwood twist together," the woman said. "It belonged to a family who once traded here often. They stopped coming years back after a trouble that belonged to more than one side." The woman did not glare at either of them. Her voice carried sadness the way a river carries silt. She set the cloth down and motioned to a trunk behind the counter. From it, she drew a narrow band of woven fibers, edges worn, colors faded to quiet earth. The pattern matched the cloth like a moon to its reflection. She said it had been left with a note from a rider who never gave his name. The note asked her to keep it safe until the one who would know it came looking. The girl lifted the band. It felt as if it had been made to circle her wrist. When she fastened it, the fit was perfect. Not tight, not slack. The old woman watched her with a careful calm. She spoke again of the river bend, of a flood season that had taken more than trees, of a quarrel that widened into a canyon when grief hardened into blame. The Apache listened without moving. The girl felt the edge of tears but held them back. She sensed how easily her mind could fill the empty spaces with guesses and feared what shape those guesses would take. Before dusk, the door opened and a tall man stepped in, wearing a hat pulled low. He nodded to the old woman and bought salt, sugar, and a roll of cartridge paper. When he turned, the girl caught the flash of a badge pinned inside his vest, half hidden. Not a marshal from her town? Another jurisdiction. He glanced at the Apache with a measuring look, and then at the girl's wrist. His gaze lingered on the band before he tipped his hat and left. The old woman's eyes narrowed. She told them to sleep in the storeroom and leave before dawn. She would set jars of water and flatbread by the door. Sleep did not come easy. The girl lay on a rug that smelled of cedar and listened to mice scratch at the walls. Through a knothole, she saw the Apache, sitting just outside, back against the post, knife across his knees. The badge man troubled her thoughts. Was he following the drifters or following them? Was his interest in law or in the reward posters that turned grief into coin? In the corner of the room stood a stack of newspapers used to wrap goods. She pulled one free and read by the light that leaked across the floor. A small column from a town near the river bend told of a family lost to rising water and confusion during a raid that may not have been a raid at all. The lines were cautious, the kind that hide more than they show. At the bottom was a mention of a child unaccounted. For when the waters fell, near midnight, she slept and dreamed of a woman running through tall grass, dress heavy with water. The woman looked back, her face blurred by rain and fear, and reached out a hand. The girl woke with the taste of river on her tongue. She sat up and touched the band at her wrist. The weave felt like a heartbeat. They left before sunrise, skirting the hills and keeping low. The Apache set a steady pace. By late morning, the land opened to a long valley, where cattle grazed under the watch of boys who carried rifles older than they were. One of the boys shaded his eyes and called out a warning. He had the nervous look of someone told to guard what he did not fully understand. The girl raised both hands to show peace. The Apache stood tall and silent. From a ranch house at the far end of the valley, a wagon rolled toward them, dust rising behind it like a signal flag. The man driving wore a suit that had seen better days. Beside him sat a woman in a bonnet with a veil to spare her skin from the hard light. The man introduced himself as a representative for the railroad and said the valley belonged to the company under patent. He used long words the way a gambler spreads cards. He offered water and kept his smile fixed. The woman watched with eyes that missed nothing. When she saw the band on the girl's wrist, her hand twitched toward her throat as if to steady a tremor. She asked whether the girl had kin near the river bend. The girl said she did not know. The woman's mouth pressed into a line that meant sorrow or warning. Perhaps both. The railroad man spoke of plans aligned through the valley. Jobs for those who signed early, security for families who pledged loyalty. He slid a paper across the wagon seat. A map with neat ink lines that looked harmless until the girl imagined what those lines would mean on the ground. The Apache said nothing. His silence held a refusal deeper than any speech. The man's smile thinned. He said there had been incidents: stray cattle taken, survey stakes pulled in the night, riders ambushed on the ridge. He hinted that the company would answer if the law did not. The girl felt the air around them grow tight. She asked a question to loosen it. Had a lawman come through, wearing a badge inside his vest? The man lifted a brow. He said several men carried badges when it suited them. He advised caution around anyone who hid the symbol he claimed to stand for. They parted with strained courtesy. As the wagon turned, the veiled woman looked back once more and gave the girl a look that felt like a message, the kind only another woman would send when words were not safe. They climbed into higher country where juniper gave way to pine. Clouds piled on the horizon. The Apache said the storm would not break yet, but the air carried the charge of a coming change. They stopped at a ridge that overlooked the river bend. From above, the land folded into a cradle of green where willow and cottonwood grew thick. She recognized the bend from the old woman's story, even though she had never stood here before. Down in the shade, someone had built new shelters. Smoke rose in thin lines, and figures moved between water and brush. The Apache's jaw tightened. He said the camp below was not his people's and not hers. It was a mixed campman who fought for pay, a trader bent by debt, and a preacher who promised safety in exchange for obedience. The preacher talked of cleansing the valley. He bought information and sold fear. The girl stared until the scene blurred. Somewhere in that tangle of shelters might be the badge man. Somewhere, perhaps, people who knew the truth of the flood year and the missing child. She asked the Apache how he planned to approach. He said they would not walk into a camp built on threats. They would move with river habits, quiet, persistent, shaping the banks by patience. He had people near who could help. They would send a sign after dark. They built a small hide of branches and lay still through afternoon heat. From the ridge they heard voices rise from the camp below. A man cursed the preacher for shortening wages. Another bragged of catching an Apache boy south of the divide and selling him to a rancher in need of hands. That voice made the Apache's eyes go ice cold. He did not move, but the girl felt the force of his stillness like a held storm. She placed her hand near his, not touching, yet close enough to say that she heard and understood. Near dusk. A kestrel flashed low over the ridge and dropped a feather in the brush. The Apache retrieved it and tucked it behind a rock. That was the sign. A woman with a bright scarf stepped from the trees west of the ridge and approached with no sound. She carried a bundle and a face like the land after rain softened, but strong. She and the Apache greeted one another as kin. The woman turned to the girl and studied her wrist. The scarf woman spoke of a family once held between two worlds, 1 foot among settlers, 1 foot among the people of the river. She said the flood had not taken that family. Men had taken them first, and the water had covered the evidence. The girl felt the ground tilt under her. She asked where the child from the story had gone. The scarf woman met her eyes and said the child lived, hidden by those who feared the preacher's men and the company's reach. The scarf woman did not say more. She handed the bundle to the Apache and melted back into trees. Inside the bundle lay a small wooden carving, smooth from many hands. It showed a willow bending over water, and on the willow hung a tiny band carved in relief. The Apache passed it to the girl. Her fingers closed around it as if guided by memory. A chill moved through her, even though the evening was warm. If the child lived, then someone had kept that child hidden for a reason that might have everything to do with her below. A bell rang in the camp. Men gathered near a large tent where a cross leaned heavy against the canvas. The preacher's voice rose rich and sure. He spoke of wolves and sheep, of land promised by God to those who took it with confidence, of danger from the hills and from blood that did not match the law's papers. The girl listened and felt anger rise like a slow fire. She had heard sermons before, but never one that made truth feel so twisted. Night came down. In its cover, 3 riders left the camp and turned toward the trading post valley. One wore the hidden badge. Another wore a hat with a silver band. The third rode the horse that dragged its right hind a little. The Apache watched them fade into darkness and then looked at the girl. They both understood that the riders were hunting threads connected to them. The Apache said they would move before dawn, along the river's secret path. They would find the willow place. And from there they would decide the next step. She lay awake under the ridge, listening to the river and to her own breath. Somewhere not far off, an owl called. She held the wooden carving against her chest and counted heartbeats until the count broke and began again. She thought of the veiled woman's warning glance, the old woman's measured care, the mixed camp and its hungry preacher, the badge that flashed only when it served. She thought of her father's steady voice and her mother's guarded eyes. She wondered which part of their story had been love and which part had been fear. She knew the answers would cut. She did not sleep. Neither did the Apache. Just before dawn, a faint light touched the far rim. The river sent up a cool breath. A coincidental barked in the distance, then went silent. The Apache lifted his hand for stillness. Hooves sounded on stone, careful and slow. Shapes moved along the ridge behind them, 3 men. Close to the ground, rifles cradled, the kind who learned patience the hard way. The badge man was not with them. These were scouts used to doing a quiet piece of work before breakfast. The Apache's eyes met the girl's, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to 2 people and a choice. Then he motioned toward the narrow run of boulders that led to the river path. They would have one chance to slip through the spine of rock before the scouts reached the lookout. If they made it, the river would carry their trail away. If they failed, the day would begin with guns and a reckoning they were not ready to face. She tightened the band on her wrist, set the carving in her pocket, and stepped where he stepped. The stones were cold under her palms. The scouts moved closer. A pebble shifted. One man lifted his head quick as a fox. He stared in their direction and raised 2 fingers to signal the others. She held her breath, feeling the land wait with her. The first sunlit line touched the willow tops at the bend. The river whispered below, promising a way forward that could save them or drown them in deeper. Truth, the stones under her hands felt sharper with every step, biting into her palms as if the canyon itself wanted to hold her still. The Apache moved ahead, silent as shadow, his body low against the rocks. Behind them, the scouts closed the distance, their rifles cradled, boots striking the ground with a rhythm that carried purpose. She could feel the moment tightening, each breath like a rope pulling tighter across her chest. The river's murmur below sounded like a promise and a threat at the same time. If they reached it, they might vanish into its cover. If they failed, the valley would echo with gunfire before the day had even begun. A loose stone shifted under her boot. The sound was slight, but in the silence of dawn it cracked like thunder. One of the scouts froze and lifted his head. His eyes narrowed, his face turning toward their hiding place. He raised 2 fingers, a signal she did not understand, but one that made the other men halt and draw nearer. She pressed herself flatter against the rock, heart pounding in her ears. The Apache's hand came back, steady and firm, telling her to wait, to breathe. He glanced toward the run of boulders that sloped into the river path. It was their only chance. The sun broke over the rim of the canyon, light spilling across the land in long bands of gold. It lit the scouts' rifles, glinting against iron, making the danger all the sharper. She could see their faces now, hard and sunburned, eyes narrowed with hunger for coin or blood. The Apache whispered a single word in his tongue, then motioned for her to move. She slid down the rocks, her dress catching on a jagged edge, tearing further, but she did not stop. The sound of the river grew louder as the stones gave way beneath her. The Apache followed, his presence close. His body a shield against the open ground. Behind them came the sharp click of a rifle being readied. One of the scouts shouted, a harsh sound that broke the morning calm. The first shot rang out, a sharp crack that sent a spray of stone chips across her face. She bit back a cry and pushed forward. The Apache grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a slab of granite, just as another bullet struck, echoing against the canyon wall. The sound rolled across the valley, carrying farther than they wished. Whoever heard it would know that blood was being hunted in the canyon. They crouched behind the rock, breaths ragged, hearts racing. The Apache met her eyes, his gaze fierce yet steady, and she knew he was measuring not only the danger, but her strength. She tightened her grip on the wooden carving in her pocket, its smooth surface grounding her, reminding her of the path that had brought her here. She could not falter now, not when the truth was so close. Not when the river's path might carry her closer to what had been hidden for so long. The scouts moved carefully, spreading out to trap them. She could hear the crunch of boots on stone, the low murmur of voices. They were closing in. The Apache placed his hand against the rock, listening to the vibrations, then whispered for her to stay low. He slipped around the edge, swift and silent, drawing their attention. Another shot cracked, then another, both aimed at him as he darted through the shadows. She used the chance to slide down toward the river path, stones scraping her hands, her breath loud in her own ears. When she reached the narrow bend where the boulders opened to the river, she paused, searching for him. For a moment she saw nothing but rising dust and sunlight broken by gunfire. Then he appeared, moving like the wind, his knife flashing in the first scout's hand before the man could fire again. The struggle was quick and fierce, the sound of fists and bone carrying across the canyon. She turned away, not from fear of him, but from fear of what would happen if she watched too long and froze. She slid further down, feet splashing into the cold shallows of the river. The water rushed against her ankles, strong enough to tug at her balance, as if testing her resolve. She steadied herself and looked back. 2 scouts remained, one circling the high ground, the other closing fast. The Apache fought in the rising dust, his strength clear, his movements sharp and sure. Yet she saw the danger in the numbers. She wanted to call out, to do something, but her voice stuck in her throat. The scout on the high ground raised his rifle, sighting down toward the fight. She felt terror surge through her. Without thinking, she picked up a stone from the river's edge and hurled it with all her strength. The stone struck the canyon wall near the scout, breaking his focus, sending his shot wide. The sound of the bullet striking stone rang like a bell across the canyon. The Apache seized the opening and drove his opponent back, forcing him into the ground with the weight of his fury. The remaining scout cursed and ran for cover. For a heartbeat, silence fell, broken only by the river's rush. Then the Apache called to her, his voice urgent. She stumbled through the shallows to meet him, her body trembling from the effort. He pulled her close, his grip strong, and together they moved downriver, away from the canyon's open mouth. Behind them, shouts rose again, more voices than before, carried on the wind. The scouts had allies close. They followed the river's winding course, the water masking their trail, the trees above offering cover. Yet she could not shake the feeling of being hunted. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch set her heart racing. The band on her wrist felt tighter, as though the threads themselves knew the noose was drawing closer. She thought of the preacher's voice, of the badgeman's cold eyes, of the railroad's promises written in ink that bled with lies. All of them were threads in the same snare. Pulling tighter around her, by nightfall they reached a grove of willows where the river bent wide and shallow. The Apache stopped, his face hard in the fading light. He said this was the place the scarf woman had spoken of, the place where the truth had been buried beneath flood and fear. She looked around at the gnarled trunks, at the way the roots twisted deep into the soil, and she felt a shiver pass through her. It was as though the land itself held memory, waiting for her to see. He told her they could not stay long. The preacher's men would follow the shots. The badge man would track the whispers. The railroad's riders would be drawn to the smoke of trouble. Yet he said she had to stand here at the bend to feel what was hers. She stepped forward, her feet sinking into the damp earth, her eyes drawn to the water's edge. She knelt, brushing aside reeds and mud, and her hand closed around something hard, half buried. She pulled it free, a fragment of pottery, patterned with the same designs as the cloth and the band. The sight of it struck her like a blade. Her chest heaved, her breath short. She dropped to her knees, staring at the piece in her hand, knowing without question that it belonged to the story she had been denied. The Apache watched her, his silence steady, his eyes holding both strength and sorrow. She wanted to scream, to demand the rest of the truth. But the sound would not leave her throat. The night deepened around them, shadows stretching long. An owl called from the trees, low and haunting. Then, faint at first, she heard the sound of horses approaching. The Apache's hand went to his knife, his body tense. She rose, clutching the fragment in one hand, the carving in the other, the band tight on her wrist. She knew the riders were coming. She knew the moment of reckoning was near. The sound grew louder, hooves striking stone, voices carrying through the dark. She could make out words orders shouted, threats promised, a call for the girl with the torn dress, the girl who was not who they said she was. Her breath came fast, her heart a drum against her ribs. The Apache placed himself between her and the sound, his stance unyielding, his figure a wall of resolve. She realized then that everything the river, the band, the carving, the cloth, the whispers, had been leading to this place. This night, this breath held between silence and storm. She could feel the truth just beyond reach, waiting to break free, waiting to change everything. But before it could be spoken, before it could be known, the riders came into view. Their torches flaring against the dark, their rifles glinting in firelight, the girl tightened her grip. The earth cold beneath her feet, the river whispering at her side. The Apache drew his blade and set his shoulders. The riders spread out, voices echoing across the willow grove. She knew the climax of her story was rushing toward her like the floodwaters of the past, and there was no turning back. The truth waited just beyond the firelight. And so did the reckoning. The riders spread across the grove, their torches throwing long, jagged shadows through the willows. The flames made the branches look like grasping hands, reaching for anyone who dared to step into the clearing. The girl stood frozen by the river's edge, clutching the fragment of pottery and the carving, the band pressing against her wrist as if it were alive. The Apache did not move, his knife low at his side, his stance steady like a wall carved from the canyon itself. She felt the tension between them and the riders grow until it seemed the very air would break. The preacher rode at the front, his face lit by the torch he carried, his eyes sharp with a fire of their own. His voice rose above the wind, smooth and strong, promising salvation to his followers and judgment to those who stood in his way. He called her name with the same authority he used when speaking of Scripture, twisting it into a weapon. He declared that she had been led astray by a savage, that she had been taken from her rightful place, and that only through him could she return to the safety of her people. His words cut through her, but the truth now pulsed in her hands. Undeniable and heavy, the Apache stepped forward, his voice low yet clear. He said the preacher's words were lies, built on fear, spoken to break apart what the land itself had bound. He told them the girl did not belong to the preacher's story or to the company's lines drawn on maps. She belonged to the truth of the river, to the family that had been stolen, to the history buried under flood and silence. His words carried across the grove, steady and certain. And for the first time she felt her heart steady with them. The preacher's face darkened, his voice rising louder, sharper. He warned his men that the Apache spoke in deceit, that the girl's presence here was proof of corruption, that she was to be taken back no matter the cost. His hand lifted, and rifles rose with it. In that instant, the night held its breath. She thought of her father, of her mother's careful silences, of the stories never told. She thought of the band on her wrist, the cloth, the carving, the pottery. All of it pointed to one truth that could not be erased by bullets or sermons. She took a step forward before fear could stop her. Her voice rang out, trembling yet fierce. She told them she knew now that she was not who they had told her to be, that her blood carried the river, the willow, the stories hidden away. She declared that no preacher, no company, no badge could strip that from her. The words surprised even her as they fell into the night. But once spoken, they carried strength she had not known she possessed. The men shifted uneasily, their rifles wavering. The preacher's eyes burned, but his voice faltered for the first time. From the shadows behind the riders came the sound of more horses. Figures appeared, moving without torches, their faces painted by starlight rather than fire. The Apache's band had arrived, silent and sure, surrounding the grove with a presence that needed no announcement. They did not shout or threaten. They simply watched, their stillness carrying more weight than any weapon. The preacher's men looked around, nerves creeping into their movements. The preacher shouted at them to stand firm. But their fear betrayed him. The badge man emerged from the group, his vest glinting faintly where the hidden symbol lay. He looked from the preacher to the girl, then to the Apache. His face was unreadable, his eyes shifting like a man caught between duty and profit. For a moment, the grove held every side of her story, the lies of the preacher, the silence of the badge, the strength of the Apache, and her own trembling truth. She realized then that the choice no longer belonged to anyone else. It belonged to her. She lifted her hand, showing the band at her wrist, the fragment of pottery in her palm. She spoke again, louder now, her voice steady. She told them the river had carried her here, that the land had shown her who she was, and that no fire or flood could erase it. She declared that she would not return to a life built on silence and fear. She would walk forward with the truth, whatever it cost. The Apache's band stepped closer, their presence tightening the circle. The preacher's men began to falter, some lowering their rifles, some glancing at each other with doubt. The badge man turned his horse and muttered something under his breath, too low for her to catch, before riding slowly back into the shadows. His absence was a weight lifted, but not enough to ease the danger. The preacher's face twisted with rage, his torch flaring as he raised it high. He cried out that she was cursed, that the land had poisoned her blood, that she would drag them all into ruin. His words cracked through the night. But they carried less power now. The Apache stepped beside her, his presence solid, his voice calm. He told the preacher that lies built on fear crumble when faced with truth. He said the river remembers the willow. Remembers, and so does the blood of those who were wronged. His words spread across the grove, steady as the water's flow. For a long moment, silence hung between them all, heavy and waiting. Then, one by one, the preacher's men lowered their rifles. The torches dipped toward the ground. Doubt carved cracks into the preacher's power, and he felt it. His rage grew, but without his men's strength behind him, his voice fell hollow. He dropped the torch into the earth, sparks scattering, and turned his horse sharply away. His departure was not victory, but retreat. Leaving behind the smell of smoke and the echo of lies, the riders scattered, some following him, others melting into the dark, unwilling to fight against what they no longer believed in. The grove fell into quiet, the firelight fading, the stars returning to their place above. The Apache's band remained still, watching, guarding, until the danger passed. Then they approached, their faces calm, her eyes filled with a weight she could not yet name. The scarf woman stepped forward, same one who had given them the carving. She reached for the girl's wrist, touching the band gently, then nodded. She spoke of the family taken, of the flood that had hidden the truth, of the child carried away and hidden in silence. The girl listened, her heart heavy, yet strangely light, for the pieces of the puzzle now aligned. She was the child. The truth she had feared was her own story. Stolen and buried, but never erased. tears filled her eyes. Not only for herself, but for her mother, who had carried the weight of silence, and for her father, who had lived with fear in his heart. The Apache's gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. He said the truth was no longer hidden. She was free to choose what came next. The band at her wrist no longer felt like a chain, but a thread linking her to something greater. She looked at the river, at the willows swaying in the night breeze, and felt both sorrow and strength. The land had claimed her, the truth had claimed her, and she would carry it forward. She would not live in silence anymore. They stayed in the grove until dawn, the light spilling across the river, washing the world clean. The Apache's band prepared to move, guiding them deeper into the land that had once been hers by blood. The girl stood at the water's edge one last time, her reflection broken by the current. She saw not the frightened child who had whispered words she did not understand, but a woman who now knew where she came from, who had faced fire and shadow and chosen truth as they turned to leave. She looked back at the willows and whispered her own promise, not to forget, not to hide, but to carry the story forward. The Apache walked beside her, silent but present, and she knew their paths were bound by more than chance. The world beyond the canyon still carried danger, still carried lies, but within her now was the strength of truth, the strength of the river and the strength of the blood that had survived. The journey was far from over, but the silence that had once bound her was broken forever. And as the land stretched before them, wide and endless, she felt the first true breath of freedom in her chest. Top of form, bottom of form,